Christopher Nolan's Odyssey is splitting the internet. But while everyone is arguing about Black Helens and Viking ships, hardly anyone is missing the real point: how Christopher Nolan has taken apart the very core of Homer's epic. And the maddest part of it, of all people, it is parts of the online right who are celebrating him for it as a subversive masterpiece. Why that is, to put it gently, rather nonsensical, and why this film is in the end, above all, one thing, namely diabolically confusing, is what we'll be looking into today. What a time to make a comeback on YouTube. Only a few weeks after Citizen Vigilante was crowned the new mascot of the online right, the internet is ablaze once again. This time, though, the dividing line runs less cleanly along the political camps or along the lines of good taste. Because by now it has gotten around all the way to Hollywood. Rage bait is a legitimate means of building reach. And so, even a week after its release, there reigns complete disagreement as to whether we're dealing with woke trash or with a right-coded subversive masterpiece. Let's take a closer look. The most striking thing is surely the tone of the film, and that includes the color tone. Instead of drifting through a colorful, sun-drenched Mediterranean world, Nolan's Odysseus chugs along on his borrowed dragon boat across what feels like the Baltic Sea in November, which some conspiracy-minded viewers immediately read as a masterful wink towards the theory of the Baltic Odyssey. There's also agreement by now, at least on the surface, that Nolan has produced a rather free adaptation. But while Nolan's defenders see precisely that as an argument for the film's artistic worth, hardly any critic disputes the right to adapt historical material freely. It's simply that adaptations of the original material are measured by different standards than loose adaptations are. Because even if Nolan's production design and casting were inconsistent, there can be no doubt that he by no means transplanted the film into some other fantastical age. On the contrary, he actually reinforced the historical references to the Bronze Age, deliberately weaving in the sea peoples and the collapse of the Bronze Age several times over. Screen adaptations of ancient historical material are usually cleanly separated. Loosely inspired works, you could even call Planes, Trains and Automobiles an Odyssey-inspired work, stand on one side, and more or less faithful adaptations on the other. Nolan wanders here, once again one must say, quite deliberately so, between the two worlds. Some find that brilliant, but it is decidedly problematic, as one is inclined to say these days. Nolan himself has stated in interviews that he places his work in the tradition of the spirit of Homer. And if that reminds you of the spirit of the council in the Catholic Church, I don't think that's a coincidence. Anyway, it deals with the same timeless themes, according to Nolan. Central to this, for him, is the law of Zeus that pervades the film, the law of hospitality.
This concept of xenia, we don't refer to it as xenia in the film because I think that would be confusing. So we just refer to it as Zeus's law, but it's that idea that, you might look like a humble beggar, but you could be a god in disguise. And that becomes the theological underpinning for a society that saw gods everywhere. Gods walked amongst us back then in everybody's estimation. It becomes the theological underpinning of the golden rule, the idea that, you know, treat others as you would be treated, and that being the glue that binds society together. The more I thought about it, the more that became important to the project, because the more you realize that, yeah, back then, leaving the house for more than, you know, a day or two, you're by definition throwing yourself at the mercy of strangers. And society can only function with respect for strangers. The more you look at it, the more we talked about it, the more we started bringing the project together, the more you realize nothing's changed. We're just as dependent on that. Nothing's changed in that regard. And so it's a point of connection with this text of 3,000 years ago that isn't just a great adventure story, but it's also a kind of ethical and moral foundation that connects us to a very different time.
The problem is that said Zeus, like all the other gods except Athena, who in the original do not merely appear, but decisively shape the plot, was banished by Nolan. And so one of the film's central problems surfaces for the first time. If the gods are not actively involved, if, like Athena, they are merely manifestations of one's own bad conscience, then there is no authority left that could grant this law. It is then simply a tradition, a custom between human beings, nothing more than that. But where does such a tradition derive its absolute authority from, if there is no transcendence? It is probably the most obvious instance of Nolan's own atheistic worldview shining through here. And out of it grows what is perhaps the film's greatest discrepancy. The omnipresent theme of guilt is resolved neither, as some claim, in Christian terms, nor through the gods of Olympus permitting Odysseus to return home. No, he forgives himself in the end, which hollows out the entire question of guilt and atonement that had governed the whole film up to that point. This is also the point where the Christian reading, which some have tried to graft onto the film, falls apart, because the concept of guilt for the fall of Troy, in the way Nolan uses it, was unknown to Greek antiquity. This consciousness of guilt only arises with Christianity, but there redemption can come only through God. And God, in turn, has no place in Nolan's film. And that, incidentally, is no slip-up. Already in Interstellar, humanity saved itself from destruction, not through an act of grace from without, but through its own self-deification into multi-dimensional beings. A great deal has also been said about the fact that the film deliberately strips away almost every moment of Odysseus in which his humor, his cunning, and his hubris shine through. In the case of the famous exchange with the Cyclops Polyphemus, in which Odysseus introduces himself as nobody, only to reveal to him after the blinding who had actually done it, Nolan talked his way out of it by claiming that it wouldn't work in English. And yet there were countless earlier adaptations that handled the scene perfectly well. To say nothing of the fact that Nolan, when it comes to dialogue in his film, overdraws the bow more than Odysseus himself ever did in his prime. For the sake of fidelity to the source, one could easily have kept this passage in. But Nolan removed nearly every trace of this side of Odysseus' character, save for a few moments which feel all the more jarring as a result, but which were indispensable to the plot. And so Odysseus now fires an arrow at Polyphemus while fleeing, entirely unmotivated, so that the pretext is supplied which explains why Poseidon curses Odysseus' homeward voyage. In the original, it was the moment when his hubris became his stumbling block. Here, it was simply moronic. The moment when Odysseus has himself lashed to the mast in order to hear the song of the sirens doesn't fit Nolan's interpretation either, because why would a depressed war veteran expose himself to something like that? In the original, though, here too, Odysseus' hubris, but also his thirst for knowledge and his curiosity came fully to the fore. Nolan couldn't cut the sirens from the film. They were too important for that, and this scene couldn't be dispensed with either. But it falls entirely outside the frame of Nolan's Odysseus. And, last of all, the massacre of the suitors makes no sense from the perspective of the traumatized Odysseus, because even if one were to read it as a relapse into old patterns, it still wouldn't be clear how Odysseus can grant himself absolution afterward by setting off on a luxury voyage into exile. I've mentioned it elsewhere already. Nolan's Odysseus is in large part reminiscent of John Rambo in First Blood. Of his slyness, we see little to nothing. Instead, we see a traumatized war veteran trying to get home and never quite arriving. In both cases, this culminates in violence at the end, but with one crucial difference. John Rambo falls back into that pattern like a hunted animal. He does not choose violence, it is the only means still available to him when he's cornered. Nolan's Odysseus, by contrast, sneaks into the palace actively, just as in Homer's original, and plans his revenge on the suitors. It is a calculated ruse, carried out with cold deliberation. In Homer, that works. In Nolan, there is no logical explanation for it. Turn it this way and that, however you like. Christopher Nolan deconstructs Homer's Odyssey. And in doing so, he delivers a film that is by no means as original as his fans claim. Depressed, traumatized men are, so it sometimes feels, the only masculine archetypes modern cinema still has to offer. And even though the various casting decisions ultimately had far less screen time than expected, there are a few key places where a political tilt, and yes, that tilt is decidedly left, even if it doesn't come across as modern woke, comes through very clearly. It is no accident that of all people, the trans actor Elliot Page, who is already killed off in the film's opening scene, resurfaces in the underworld and leads the indictment against Odysseus and his cunning. What Odysseus was in Homer stands on trial throughout Nolan's film. It is thus also a repudiation of heroic masculinity, and not merely of the crude, aggressive kind, but of the kind that knows how to fuse cunning, intellect, and manhood. Against this backdrop, a little thought experiment is worth the trouble. Let's simply list, soberly, what Nolan has done with the material. The roles of the original, recast for the most part, empathically diverse. Half of the supernatural creatures, cut. The colors, desaturated. The bright adventure turned into a dark, brutal, thoroughly depressing piece of work. Honestly, if you read that list out to someone without mentioning Nolan's name, what would they guess? Presumably the next woke franchise reboot. Precisely the sort of politically compromised film that the internet has been tearing to shreds for a decade now. And there we are at what is actually remarkable, namely how readily parts of the online sphere forgive Nolan, of all people, the very mechanisms that sent them into a rage elsewhere. Whenever some other franchise is rebooted and reinterpreted, the outcry is loud. Leave our works alone. Invent something of your own. And rightly so. But with Nolan's Odyssey, it's suddenly legitimate artistic expression. That is a double standard. Sadly, one has to note that most of these justifications are introduced with an "I don't know the original, but..." One can't escape the impression that for many people, this kind of repainting is perfectly fine as long as it doesn't concern their own hobby horse. And for anyone still unconvinced, these past few days one could hear it from none other than Emily Wilson, the feminist translator of the Odyssey, whom many online had blamed for Nolan's reading, that what she sees in this film is an excessive psychologizing and a fixation on the guilt of Odysseus. The film, according to Wilson, is very concerned with guilt, but not concerned with glory. The glory that most certainly did drive the original Odysseus.
I'm not sure if I see it as an entirely anti-war film, but it certainly presents us with an Odysseus who feels very bad about certain things that he's done in war and is struggling to process them in a very, I would say, very modern, psychiatrized way. And he's struggling to process them and needs drugs to do so for help with his recovery.
Right.
And he seems to feel bad about being a warrior, and we never actually get to see him doing much warrioring, which I thought in a way was a bit of a shame. I mean, we do get to see the bow, which is lovely, but I think in some ways, I mean, I was realizing, thinking about the film, there's a tolerance for ambiguity in the world of the Odyssey, which I don't think there exactly is in the world of Hollywood blockbuster action films.
Right.
And I think that's one of the big challenges for Nolan, right?
Yeah.
Is that he has to make the protagonist a likable all-American hero,
right,
which is a real challenge if you're basing this on a poem where the hero is not necessarily motivated by romantic love or being a nice suburban parent, but actually he wants glory, and he wants to get spoils from the sack of a city, which is, you'll see what Nolan does with all of that, but it's different things from what Homer does.
Right.
I kept looking in vain for a sense that this was a film about glory. I think it's a film that has some interest in shame, but I don't think it has any interest in glory.
Last of all, an important aspect that only came into sharper focus after a few days. Many of the interpretations circulating online perform great contortions in order to turn Nolan's Odyssey into a subversive work of the right or even into a Christian work. But for the most part, they proceed with a crowbar, deliberately ignoring plot holes and emphasizing particular aspects that happen to suit their reading. The film itself, however, delivers neither clear answers nor clear questions, aside from the xenophile fixation on the law of hospitality and the deconstruction of Homer. Granted, films that leave room for interpretation have existed before. Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey also leaves a good deal open at the end, but it takes no contortions to turn it into an ideologically congenial film. Artistic and ideological interpretation are two very different things. Besides, the actual plotline is always clear. With Nolan, though, the film deliberately embraces confusion. Is it historical, mythological, modern, free, in the spirit of Homer? All of this generates endless debate, which in marketing terms is surely a great win for the production company, but for the viewers? In a conversation the other day, a colleague said how wonderful it was that there's finally a blockbuster again that provokes such wide-ranging debate. But I ask myself, is that really so wonderful? Because I think there's a difference between discussing an open ending and a film that from its production design all the way to its closing punchline is one continuous accumulation of vaguenesses. All the worse if there is intent behind it, because there is a difference between the various readings of a work, which always exist and which are a good thing too, and deliberate ambivalence. Indeed, even deliberate confusion. I say this only reluctantly, and to some it may seem like criticism that goes too far. But confusion over meaning and the division that comes with it have never been the hallmark of the good, but rather that of the gentleman known as dicis et non facis. It is, to put it plainly, diabolical. Nolan's Odyssey does not speak the language of Homer. It does not sing as the epic itself demands in its poem. It transforms the vital work of a culture in ascent into the weary contemplation of a civilization in the late winter of its existence. It reduces a character as many-sided as Odysseus to one all-determining sense of guilt. It is obsessed with delivering a comment on the zeitgeist and is, in doing so, deliberately unclear about what that comment actually consists of. None of that is the mark of a masterpiece, but rather of a wedge being driven between us and the Odyssey itself, justified only by the contortion and the intellectual laziness which hold that such an approach to the original isn't possible for us today anyway. One good thing, though, has come of all this. Increasingly, people online are now stumbling upon older adaptations, many of them with smaller budgets and dubious special effects at times, and yet one often senses a collective sigh of relief, an insight into the pointlessness of modern visual spectacle in the face of the sheer substance of a story. Perhaps it will lead to a broader realization that all the modern trickery, whether digital or analog as Nolan prefers it, can be no substitute for even a glimmer of spirit. My hopes on that front are modest, but one ought, after all, to look on the bright side now and then. You'll find my complete review of the Odyssey on my Substack. The link is in the description. If you enjoyed this, I'd be very grateful if you left a subscription and a thumbs up, because the channel needs all of that to get going in the first place. And do let me know in the comments what you make of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey. Is there a subversive approach, after all, that explains all of this? Or do the arguments of the Nolan fans melt away like wax on the wings of Icarus in the sun? Have a lovely week, and until next time, yours, David Boos.